Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. As someone said this morning, welcome to the best journalism festival in the world, in the nicest place in the world. My name is Patricia. I'm here to moderate the panel, How the Far Right is Going Global. And to discuss this, we have here, I was going to start by Luke, but let's change the order. Sorry. Andrea Dip, she's a special reporter at Agência Pública. For the past 2 years, she has been investigating the transnational coalitions of far-right religious movements across the globe. She's currently an associated research fellow at Freie Universität Berlin and part of the international research group on authoritarianism of Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. Natalia Viana, no, I'm not going to keep you. Okay, Luke. Luke O'Brien is an investigative reporter and narrative writer who has contributed to The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, New York Times, and Wired. And he's also a researcher at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. For the past few years or a year and a half, he has been researching the January 6, 2021 insurrection in Washington and the Stop the Steal disinformation campaign. And last but not least, Natalia Viana is the co-founder and executive director of Agência Pública, Brazil's largest non-profit newsroom. She leads long-term investigations and multimedia projects about human rights violations, and her team has won over 70 awards. She was a 2022 Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. All right. Well, we're going to discuss the similarities between the insurrections that have been taking place around the world. I think you might have seen that in Brazil we also had our anti-democratic attack on January 8th this year, which was very similar to what happened in the US on January 6, 2021. And we have here 3 journalists who are researching and investigating deeply the connections between the actors, the main, let's say, insurrectionists and people who have been stimulating this kind of anti-democratic attack. So to start with the basics with Natalia. Natalia, can you tell us what are the similarities? In what way January 6th Capitol attack and January 8th attacks against Brasilia are similar?
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you all for coming. Just wanted to start by saying, first things first, free Julian Assange. I hope that we all take this home. So, I don't know if you've seen, I'm sure you've seen on the news, how like exactly 2 years after the Capitol was stormed by a bunch of protesters, anyway, following Trump's line of fraudulent elections, the exact same thing happened in Brazil. It so happened that I was last year in the US, and I managed to really take a deep dive on how Trump had crafted this narrative. Trump and the Trump supporters and his closest allies managed to craft this narrative of a fraud in the 2020 elections that led to the invasion of the Capitol. Me and my team then started investigating, coming up with ways to investigate both the open source intelligence, like the big data that is online, especially on social media, but also doing shoe leather journalism to understand ways that we could uncover what was going on there, why these 2 events were so similar. And during all the time that I was there at Harvard, I was trying to tell everybody that the exact thing was going to happen in Brazil, because the similarities are just too much to be coincidental. So I'm going to list just some of the things that were exactly the same. Both Trump and Bolsonaro, really carefully crafted a narrative that the elections were stolen or were rigged or were prone to fraud way before they were up for re-election. So Trump, right after he was elected, he started saying that he had actually won in the popular vote, which he didn't, and so did Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro that said that he actually had won in the first round. So right at the beginning of their terms, they were sowing mistrust in the electoral processes, both in Brazil and the US. Trump and Bolsonaro used the government, the federal government, to sow mistrust. So Trump actually installed a presidential commission on electoral integrity that amounted to nothing. Bolsonaro tried to use the institutional security cabinet to open an investigation into the election that he was elected with. It's just one of the things that they did. Ahead of the elections, they asked their followers, their supporters, to go to the voting polls, the voting stations, to actually monitor if somebody was trying to steal the election, so pumping up. They had congressmen in both countries way ahead of the elections saying that the elections were rigged, they were prone to fraud. They both said that they would only accept defeat if the election was fair and square. So putting a question if they would actually accept defeat, which none of them did, of course. They both had their own stop the count strategies. So Trump, in the early morning after the election, asked for the vote count to be stopped. Bolsonaro's close allies did the same. So the communication minister, Fábio Faria, alleged that there was some, that they were being, there were some radio spots that weren't evenly divided, and then the election should be postponed because of that, but that didn't fly. But the social media influencers really vamped up this demand and this story. They both had efforts to suppress and block votes in the places where the opposition had a majority. They both had a legal battle right after the elections trying to revert the results. And then, of course, they also had very similar narratives and memes being spread. I'm going to get into that a little bit later. But of course, this is not by chance, because we managed to establish how close the relationships are between Trump's close allies and the Bolsonaro family. Very specifically, Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, met over 80 times with key people from the right wing of the US, only in the past 4 years. He met Steve Bannon in 2018 and became the representative of Steve Bannon's The Movement in South America. He then founded his own conservative institute, think tank, and brought to Brazil what is a well-known gathering of the far right, which is the Conservative Political Action Conference, the CPAC. And there is something that really strikes me, that nobody is really talking about this in the northern press. Eduardo Bolsonaro was in Washington on the eve of the invasion of the Capitol. He was not only in Washington, he met Trump's daughter 2 days before. He met also Jared Kushner, and the day before he met Mike Pillow's CEO, Mike Lindell, who was one of the key people around Trump who pushed for the Stop the Steal campaign. This is like how they are connecting. The way it developed in Brazil is that right after January 6th, President Bolsonaro, who we have to remember leads the second largest democracy in the Americas, refused to condemn the invasion. He also, at the same time when he was questioned by the press, he said, well, there were people who voted 3-4 times in the US, there were dead people voted, therefore he spread the same lies that were being spread in the US. And then at the same time that this was happening, with like a digital investigation, we managed to find that there was a campaign, an orchestrated campaign by close allies of Eduardo Bolsonaro, tweeting over 24,000 using the hashtag #GoTrump re-elect, supporting the January 6 attacks and the January 6 storming of the Capitol. In the same days, at least 6 Brazilian lawmakers, allied of the Bolsonaro, spread the same lies in Brazil. Now, these narratives were being pushed in Brazil and in the US in very similar ways. So there's like actually the same lies, the same fake news being spread in both countries. For instance, that electronic machines in both elections were tied to Venezuela and were rigged, that some voting machines would like self-fill when somebody typed, the candidates would self-fill to the opposite candidate. And other thing that John Donovan's team called misinfographics, so infographics that are complete, that are completely lying, saying that it was statistically impossible for both Trump and Bolsonaro to lead in the first hours of the vote count and then fall back, which happened in both countries as well. And then the same thing happened on the other hand. So two years later, when Bolsonaro supporters stormed the Brazilian government offices, people in the US started spreading, very important people in the far right in the US, started spreading the lie that there was a fraud in Brazilian election. The same narratives, and also they started attacking the Supreme Court, like it's quite obviously a coordinated campaign. Now, one of the things that we've been able to establish is that there is a close connection between a tight circle of people, and this is something that Luke knows a little bit more about because he's also looking at these people, and me and Luke were talking, and Luke, we came up with like these two notions that I think is very important for journalists to know. First is that this is a conspiracy, an international conspiracy to subvert democracy, at least in two countries. And the second is that what we are seeing is the formation of a reactionary international kind of alliance.
I think it's your turn. She gave you the cue. I mean, I have a question, but maybe you can just follow on.
Sure. So Natalia summed up what happened with January 8th very well. January 6th was the precursor to January 8th, and I've been focused on that for some time. And it's important to re-emphasize what she just said, that we've detected an international network here. And this is, she called it the reactionary international, but I think it could also be just termed the anti-democratic international, and a lot of these same players find each other to run influence operations in different countries, and there is a playbook now that has been established, and that playbook was put to the test in January 6th, and the Brazilian bad actors were working off that playbook in many ways, and so I've been looking at how how disinformation led to January 6th, and we've noticed that that's perhaps the key driver, in fact, of why January 6th happened. It's very important to understand that this was not a random event. This was really not even a spontaneous event. This was something that was planned. It was an orchestrated plan that was set into motion months in advance, prior even to the election in the United States. Like in Brazil, we saw many of these bad actors start to push the disinformation or hint that the disinformation campaign was about to start months before the election, in fact. And there's a network that I've been able to identify of these anti-democratic activists. Some are far-right extremists, some are political operatives, some have direct connections to the Trump administration, or had direct connections to the Trump administration, and many have connections to Steve Bannon, who was sort of a kind of puppet master type figure in this. And so they had also built the infrastructure to execute this plan over years. It happened mainly during the Trump administration, but it was happening even before that, as some of these influencers rose to prominence on social media. Social media is where they really orchestrated this attack on democracy. And prior to January 6th, we'd seen some other similar examples, smaller examples of disinformation-driven campaigns on social media that created real-world incidents. A lot of these bad actors are very much aware of how to use disinformation to mobilize people, and this is these are strategies that they were trying out for years leading up to January 6th. And I don't want to say they perfected it, but they got much better over the years. And what happened leading up to January 6th is many of them came together, many of them aligned around Bannon, but there were other sort of key nodes in this network. and they started pumping out what we call the big lie. There were various organizations that coalesced under the Stop the Steal banner. That Stop the Steal is the organization that Ali Alexander founded. And it probably, all the events leading up to January 6th, the disinformation-related events, are best thought of as falling under this Stop the Steal banner. And this began, the disinformation attack began really as soon as the election happened. You know, they were prepared. They had people in place at election centers to start taking photographs and video that then they would decontextualize and spin up into propaganda, saying, oh, there's something strange or suspicious happening with ballots at this election center. They had their propaganda campaign ready, and they had their network ready. And they were able very quickly to start mobilizing angry Trump supporters into the street, which was the goal all along. And it started small. You know, they started with dozens of people at various election centers in battleground states. And they would usually have one of the top influencers would come by the rally and whip these people up using some violent rhetoric. Alex Jones is a good example. He showed up in the I think it was the second night after the election, he showed up outside the election center in Phoenix, Arizona, and there was a group of very angry Trump supporters that were already making threats to journalists. Several militia members had invaded the election center and were, you know, asked to leave by the police when they could have just been arrested. That was actually a violation of the law, just doing that. But Alex Jones showed up and he started using incredibly inflammatory rhetoric about 1776, and we're going to hunt down leftists, and this election's being stolen. As we continued to study this, and as Stop the Steal kept going leading up to January 6th, we realized that a lot of the slogans, a lot of the terms were very similar, and he was working off of a script, as were many of the other influencers. So they had this language that they had agreed upon, much of it very inflammatory and leading toward inciting violence. And they were all on message. And the goal here was to just keep organizing events, keep using social media to push the disinformation, but also to mobilize people into the street and to make them angrier and angrier. And as the weeks rolled by, more and more people started coming out into the streets. The events got bigger and bigger. The violent rhetoric got more inflammatory. And this was all building up to January 6th. And eventually you had a very large, very angry mob of Trump supporters that descended on Washington. And you only need a handful of those people, a small percentage of them, willing to cross the line to commit actual violence. And that's what happened. And this plan almost worked. There were other plots and conspiracies to try to overturn the election from within Congress, but this, I believe, was the most powerful one, and they needed a critical mass of people to try to make their plan work. And that is why this network was so important, and the disinformation that the network was spreading. So January 6th happens, and shortly thereafter, I noticed several of these anti-democratic operatives who were critical to spreading disinformation in advance of the 2020 election in the US. They're down in Brazil, and they're working with Bolsonaro. One in particular, who is a key Trump advisor, is a guy named Jason Miller, who's now gone back to the Trump administration. But after January 6th, he was running a social media platform called Getter, which had essentially given itself over to the Bolsonaro campaign, I believe, in exchange for users to sign up. They were trying to sign up all Bolsonaro's followers. But it became kind of a free-for-all of disinformation. And I think the quid pro quo was, we'll give you our platform, you can push whatever messaging you want on there. And this ended up being a kind of a key organizing hub in Brazil for January 8th and an epicenter of disinformation there. And I believe Jason Miller and another guy were actually detained at the airport in Brazil after they'd met with Bolsonaro.
John
right?
Brandt.
Yeah, so there was this other fellow, Matthew Tiermond, was down there helping Bolsonaro, and he ended up playing a very important role in pushing the Brazilian disinformation that led to the insurrection there. And he's an important character because he really is a good representative of what we've been talking about here with the international aspect of this. He's a dual national American who has worked secretly for a far-right government in the United States, but he acts kind of as a super connector, traveling around the world, meeting with far-right political parties and far-right leaders and trying to coordinate efforts with them. We also have learned fairly recently that there was a lot of dark money, big money, possibly criminal money that was funding Getter in the form of Guo Wengui, who is this formerly fugitive Chinese billionaire. He's now been apprehended by the US authorities, but he was ostensibly on the run from the Chinese authorities and was hiding out in the United States, but he too was deeply involved in the disinformation attack leading up to January 6th, working with Steve Bannon, working with Rudy Giuliani. You probably have heard about the Hunter Biden laptop scandal. So all these people were connected to that in some fashion, trying to weaponize more disinformation to use against the election. So Guo Wengui is now being investigated by federal authorities. We'll see what comes out about that. But he was financing Getter, he was financing Tiermond, and financing Bannon. And so these are some of the key bad actors that we saw a lot of overlap with between January 6th and January 8th. Tiermond is also notable because he, until recently, was very closely associated with kind of a nexus of this reactionary international in the United States. It's an organization called the New York Young Republican Club, which up until maybe 15 years ago was seemingly a fairly normal Republican conservative organization, but was eventually colonized by a lot of these anti-democratic operatives and now masquerades as a Republican organization, but also represents sort of the infiltration that these people have made into mainstream politics in America. And this New York Young Republican Club has a lot of its members were involved in January 6th, and it has made a lot of connections overseas to other right-wing and far-right organizations, such in Italy here, Lega Nord. This Young Republican Club has a partnership with the youth branch of Lega Nord. They are also very close to Viktor Orban in Hungary. And Matthew Tiermond has been over to Hungary to speak at CPAC, this very big conservative conference that has radicalized in the United States along with the Republican Party. So we're seeing more and more of these connections and this outreach and these tendrils of extremism and authoritarianism crossing borders. And this is different than, say, like neo-Nazi terrorism, for example, because you do see that as well. You see violent neo-Nazi groups that form these international connections. What we're talking about here are more these anti-democratic influencers who actually have a lot more power and a lot more sway in politics in our countries, and they have mastered to some degree this playbook for using disinformation to attack democracy, and now as well using it to mobilize people into the street through repeated inflammatory rhetoric and repeated messaging. And this is what we're all studying right now.
Thank you. Before I get to Andrea, I just wanted to ask you guys, there's been a lot of reporting about all those overlaps and the connections over the last 2 years, right? I mean, we know that Eduardo Bolsonaro met with Trump and with the My Pillow guy and also Jason Miller. And what everybody would love to is to find concrete evidence of financing, transnational funding, or even you just mentioned that you identified a group of influencers that were acting with the Bolsonaros. What were you able, so far, what were you able to find that has not been in the news yet, that is like concrete, because this would be amazing, right? What can you give us hope in that?
Hi. One of the things that we are seeing is actually how all of this operation is actually pretty cost effective. So we're all super, oh my God, there's millions of dollars coming here and there. And what many reporters, I think including yourself, have managed to get is like some funding. So there is some funding in Brazil coming from federal congressmen, coming from Bolsonaro's budget for media that went to misinformation channels. There is some funding of, congressmen in the US who got funding from CIPAC to fly to Brazil on the 7th of September, uproar that Bolsonaro was planning. But if I was the FBI, hint, I would look into Getter. Because Getter is a very interesting operation, I'd call. It's not a business. It has never been a business. It's a right-wing social media platform whose second largest user base is in Brazil, and that is not even $1 million. So just for comparison, in Brazil, Facebook has $140 million. Sorry. Users. So it's not only a million Brazilian, not even 1 million Brazilians are there. And for Facebook has 140. So Facebook has a business model. Getter does not. We also know that Getter was financed by Wu Wei, sorry. And we also know that it was used by several actors to do transaction on cryptocurrency. So there's so much that journalists can do, but if I was the FBI, I would totally look into Getter.
Wonderful, so we can have hope. Andrea, if you could tell us about this, how this playbook is expanding to Europe, what connections have you seen?
Hi. Hello, everyone. Well, first, to give a little context, I would like to say that I have been investigating these far-right and ultra-conservative networks that connect Latin America, the United States, and Europe, mainly through moral panic, which have served, as I see, as an amalgam not only for political groups with distinctive agendas, but also for religious groups that are historically enemies or competitors, like, for example, evangelical Christians, Catholics, and Muslims, which some researchers have called an unholy alliance, and I love this term. But these groups have united around the discourses of moral panic in defense of the pure or the natural family, that which is composed, of course, of a cis man, a cis woman, and their children, and the defense of the cultural values of the natural family, which already gives carte blanche to xenophobia, for example, in the sense that these values would be threatened by immigrants, refugees with different cultural values. And they are, of course, against abortion and against the LGBTQA plus community, against what they call gender ideology, in defense of homeschooling, since the school would be not a safe space for the maintenance of these values. They unite to advocacy, to lobby at the UN, to exchange tactics and strategies, and to pressure governments and politicians to lobby. They unite in judicial organizations, etc. Another thing is that these ultra-conservative and anti-rights European organizations, unlike what one might think, are new or have been renewed in the last 10 years, or have very active youth and political training for young people happening. I can mention Hasteoir, which is a Spanish Catholic far-right organization that is linked to Vox party. Actually, they recently broke up because they said that Vox was no longer defending so strongly the family values against abortion and so on, but they have been connected historically. And this organization was founded in 2001, and in 2012 organized the World Congress of Families, which bring together the ultra-Orthodox close to Putin and reactionary North American Catholics. And then 2013 creates a fresh new brand global version called Sit and Go, as an international platform becoming the umbrella of this ultra-Catholic group, which was already carrying out LGBT-phobic campaigns and against reproductive rights in Spain, and which is also known for possible connections with the Catholic secret society El Yunque in Mexico. And despite the name change, the main strategy of action continued to be cyber activism, with the organization of online petitions and political lobbying. At Pública, we did an investigation based on data leaked by WikiLeaks in 2021, which showed how this network is articulated worldwide, having funders, including in Brazil. In the justification, I think that it's important because in the justification for the leaking of these documents, WikiLeaks said that both Hasteoir and Sit and Go run their campaigns and other work using the disguise of family principles, but the leaked documents show that their values are drawn for an ultra-conservative Christian universe. They do a lot of online actions through petitions, but they also work in real world, like for example with the hate bus, that is a bright orange bus that prints slogans like boys are boys and uses transphobic messages and tours through Spain and in America. And I find that Sit and Go example is interesting because it shows how these organizations are articulated globally. They work with cyber activism, but also in the streets. They had a rebranding. They are connected to an ultra-right-wing party in Spain and receiving funding for families of Spanish aristocracy, for Russian oligarchs, from money launderers. So because one thing that WikiLeaks shows in this leak is that Sit and Go would received funded by an Italian politician, Luca Volonté, who earlier was sentenced to 4 years in prison because he was receiving illegal money from corruption sources in Azerbaijan in exchange for votes against human rights in the European Council. And last year, I managed to infiltrate in an event of another important organization in this environment, which is the Political Network for Values, which is a transnational organization that brings together politicians, like senators, deputies, ministers, secretaries of state, and they all meet once a year to lobby. And I was able to attend all the 3 days of this event, which took place in Budapest, of course, to start showing also how much Orbán is involved in this new European far-right movement. He gave space, funding, and offered to have the headquarters of this organization established in Hungary, and he attended to the event twice. And of course, makes sense. He already made a statement criticizing the mixing of European and non-European races, for example. And this event had also a very prominent participation from Brazil with Angela Gandra, former Secretary of the Ministry of Women's Rights and Family of the Bolsonaro government, and more than 100 politicians from around the world, including some of the Trump administration, and the organization has on the board people like the president of Family Watch International, Sharon Slater. And in this Congress, what called my attention the most is how, in fact, these networks are interconnected, how they are politically connected through these politicians, and how, despite some different agendas, in all tables, in all conversations, regardless of what's being discussed, these elements were always mentioned, like the defense of the natural family, the defense of life from the conception, that it's against abortion in any circumstances, the defense of the biological sex, and anti-LGBTQ+ messages that would threaten this kind of family. And try to indoctrinate children, the discourse that glues this LGBT, that glues the LGBT community and the left in general to pedophilia, and is also very strong. In short, these are agendas that are being instrumentalized in a very powerful way to move hearts and minds and take along other neoliberal and authoritarian agendas. And another thing that caught my attention was that Hungary is being celebrated by the far right as an example to be followed, just like Orbán himself. And in a visit to United States, Orbán told that we should fight to place Christian values at the center of their politics. And he told the horrors of Nazism and communism happened because some Western states in continental Europe abandoned their Christian values. So, to finish this first part, thinking about the future, as I said, some of these networks and organizations have political training courses for young people. At last year's Congress in Budapest, I had the opportunity to listen to the manifesto of the ultra-conservative youth. And I think that we have a big problem to think about, because the far right knows how to handle the social media much better than the progressives, because they provide simplistic, shallow, memified answers that circulated more, because as Luke has said, hate circulated more on social media, and of course young people even more. And this year, the political training of the political network for values will be 6 months long at the meeting, and the meeting will take place in New York. Meanwhile, in Brazil, we have been dealing with a new phenomenon of attacks of schools that mimics the American one, especially on the part of the teenagers who have been involved in these masculinist and supremacist groups, and have had their first contact with politics through this extreme right-wing group. And I'm very concerned because today is a very important day to these groups, because of they celebrate the attack to Columbine. Yesterday we were talking, and Natalia asked what moves the minds and hearts so much in these speeches, and I was thinking about this, and I think that there is one thing that is, with moral panic, the far right takes very complex and sensitive issues, like, for example, the decriminalization of abortion or even gender studies, and gives very simple, flat, violent, and scary answers. For example, they say that abortion is murdering babies, and who will say that are in favor of murdering babies? Or they say that those who want to discuss feminism and transphobia in schools will teach children how to have sex, or that they are pedophiles, and who wants that? So I think that that's the low game. They take complex issues, simplify them, and then make up lies on top of them, like gender ideology itself, which is absolutely an invention, but has been at the center of the political discussions all over the world. And it's happening, like, I don't know, in Florida right now, or in Poland, or Italy with Meloni, that already had a lot of transphobic declarations, and also talks about gender ideology. And I think that is very curious, because isn't that also one of the challenges of journalism itself, that is fighting fake news and disinformation campaigns?
Yes, tough. I hope you were safe doing your investigations. I just wanted to ask you guys one common question, and if it's possible to be brief so that we can still squeeze in one question from the audience. What should journalists learn in order to investigate the far right? What tools, what databases, and what advice in general would you give? I know it's hard to be brief, but...
Hello. Hi. I'll try to be very brief. There is one thing that I learned, and this comes from a very obsessive mind, which is you have to learn to use, software and technological tools. I was bugging Luke for months because I was obsessed about this hashtag, and I was bugging him like, can you help me, or can you help me? But then you have to pair up with technologists, and you have to pair up with the academia, you have to pair up with the university centers that are really looking deep, and they have the tools to do this. And I think journalists have to stop being scared of that, because on the internet there is a lot of data and there is a lot of evidence of these networks and how they relate. And now even the justice, at least the justice in Brazil, is looking at this data as evidence, and this is a progress in the societal debate against disinformation. But there's another thing that I think is almost as important, which is journalists have to know that they are being used in this war. Journalists are being used because the creation of facts out of nothing, the creation of political facts out of nowhere, fights that don't exist, manifestations that don't exist, demands that don't exist in society, they spread through social media with like fake or not organic and inorganic means, and then journalists report on that, and they're just used to spread this misinformation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would stress that when you're looking at investigating these disinformation campaigns and these anti-democratic efforts, so many of which happen online, you must not forget, as a journalist, to do the traditional shoe leather reporting, because
yes,
we see a lot of journalists get caught up just looking at Twitter and looking at different nodes connecting on Twitter. But if you haven't developed that subject matter expertise, if you're not willing to pick up the phone or knock on the door or infiltrate a far-right rally, you're going to be lacking a set of information that's going to be helpful when you look at the data, and you might be able to make connections that you wouldn't see normally. And so I've found the most powerful way to report on this, it's not really magic or anything, it's traditional reporting combined with the data analysis. And I've been lucky to work with some data scientists and who have helped me create these networks. And you can see within the networks, you can see the disinformation moving, you can see these incitements to violence taking place. But then when you have that other set of data that you're working with, which is, well, this bad actor I know met with this one in person in this place, you're able to combine these two, and then you can really conduct a powerful investigation and do better storytelling.
Thank you. Andrea? How to infiltrate the far right.
Oh, well, covering all your tattoos and piercings is the first thing. I think all of that, of course, and I think that is also important to understand that some topics take time to investigate. I have been investigating the advance of Christian fundamentalism in Brazil since 2015, and this research has been evolving, and so I think that it's important to think that it's not something that it's easy or magic or it takes some time.
For how many years you have been researching this? Many, many years, right?
Almost since 2015. Wow. Yeah. But I think that in general, I have created good sources, good contacts with academics, researchers. I think that's really helpful. And with activists and the civil society groups, Antifa groups, feminist groups, queer groups, I think that they're also helping me a lot with tips or where is going to happen the next event, because they are also, of course, watching all of this. But I also did, what I also did was create a map of the main organizations and then monitor their actions online, Telegram groups, Twitter accounts, but also going to acts and events. One thing that it's also helpful is to be careful, but bold and brave. I think that at this event in Budapest, for example, I tried together with other journalist colleagues for many months to get press accreditation. We tried and never got an answer, so I decided to go there. And of course, I disguised myself, covered all my tattoos and piercings, and I got in. So I think that this is important for a reporter as well. Like, be careful, but also be bold and brave, and just go.
Wonderful. I think we have time for 2 questions from the audience, if you guys are really concise in the phrasing. Yeah, we have someone there. If you could state your name and...
Hi, my name is Tomáš Madleniak. I am from Slovakia, so Investigative Center of Jan Kuciak. I'm going to try to be very fast. We have done a little bit of investigation about these ultra-Orthodox groups in Slovakia and in the Visegrad region. We have identified Ordo Iuris, who is connected to this South America-based TFP, Traditio Familia Proprietas, you know what I'm talking about, and American and all of this. The problem was, when we got to the publication, this broader question of, is this justifiable to actually write about them if you cannot prove, you guys maybe can prove that they are planning, I don't know, coup d'etat or something like that, then okay. But if essentially what they do is advocacy and activism, which we may not like because it is not in line with our values, but that's their basically defense. That's what we came under fire from both what I would call normal conservatives, but also liberals, who told us, all right, but you are writing basically about advocacy groups that you don't like. How would you react to that?
So it depends a lot. I think it's important to report on these groups. These groups have been responsible for narratives that lead to violence in societies, but also very specifically in Brazil, which is what I know, they've been pushing to remove people's rights. And I just wanted to tell you, I don't know if you know, Agência Pública, which is the organization that I'm the director of, is a human rights investigation center. We think that groups that are organizing to remove people's rights and also to promote violence against specific groups, which they are doing, including transphobia, homophobia, and hatred against women, pretty bluntly, should be reported on. And it's a matter of public interest. Of course, it's something completely different to make an accusation without base, right? So, but that's not what we're talking about here, because what we have reported on, we have the evidence to back.
Add real quick, I think another frame to look at here when reporting on these groups are the international connections are significant because they are often pathways for foreign influence in a country. That's, you know, there could be money, there could be support coming from outside the country that is seeking to disrupt the political process in the target country, and we see that all the time. And so that's one way to cover it. And the other thing I would tell people is that when you cover this subject matter, you are going to be branded a certain way. There's nothing you can do about it. You are often dealing with propagandists and disinformation experts, and they recognize you as the enemy. They want to operate secretly, and you know, they'll have a public face that is sanitized, but they'll be doing things behind the scenes. And once you start to uncover those things, they're going to brand you. You're not going to be called a journalist, you're going to be called an activist, you're going to be called, who knows, a Marxist, a communist, whatever, even though you may be none of those things. And it's just par for the course. It comes with the job when you're covering these things.
Want to add something? So, I think we don't. Okay, sorry. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It was great. Thank you guys for such an amazing panel.